Hello everyone, today we talk about Tudor infantry recruitment, organization and unit types for our early modern warfare playlist. We have something slightly less in-depth compared to the medieval side of the story, but it's still more comprehensive in other ways. We talked already about Tudor warfare in the last year, made multiple videos also about strategy, mostly pertaining to the Armada campaign that we will have to continue soon. Today we really just stick to Tudor infantry, so we have already analyzed like other people's armies through the various arms. I think that this makes sense, also considering the scissor, paper, rock thing that pike and shot warfare sort of looks like. So if we're talking about the Renaissance warfare, at least that can be a viable way of interpretation. Nevertheless, we will browse a varied array of topics, as we've seen already in the Tudor cavalry episode that is already there. Then we talk about artillery and more, flags, even, etc. Now, under the reign of Henry VIII, as you know, England was pretty much active from a military point of view also on the continent. This is the first half of the 16th century, so a phase in which English warfare, although already lagging behind main continental military developments, was still relatively updated and at least successful in combat, like against other major European powers, mostly France, fundamentally. And Henry VIII himself was the expression of this, as he possessed a distinguished martial fervor. I will not digress now on the history of Henry VIII that we never really discussed, but that we will at some point address. Again, there is an entire playlist about Tudor history and warfare, so you can find lots of stuff there already. We also talked about the London train bands at some point, or train bands in general. That was sort of an offspin of this kind of broader infantry consideration, but it's good. It was one of the earliest videos I've ever made on Schwerpunkt. This inclination to the battlefield, and something we pointed out regarding traditional history and how this allegedly modern Europe now was still deeply into a veritable martial sense stemming from the previous millennia, also as far as monarchs were concerned. The English crown did not really have a permanent army per se. Recently I made a video exactly about this, at least the nucleus, right, the core nascent permanent army, permanent professional force. The English had something, but the point is that this did not make an army as a whole. There were some thousands men. We can check that video out if you're interested. Uploaded it last week. The whole of the English military, however, revolved essentially around a dynamic system that summoned soldiers into being only when the specter of war loomed, of course. At the core of the system stood a modest but vital nucleus of standing troops. That is, in fact, what had been established to confer more also domestic control to the monarchy. Most notably, the yeomen of the guard, whose ranks Henry swelled with deliberate intent from 200 to 600 in the opening years of his tenure. These were no mere ornamental figures confined to the royal court. In the aforementioned video, we're talking about guards at least, but the yeomen of the guard role transcended that of bodyguards, extending into active military service across the kingdom and beyond its shores. Right, the yeomen, as you know, had this third estate. Markondemned were still led, of course, by noblemen, but they squeezed together with the monarchy the nobility that, after the Wars of the Roses had been decimated, the House of the Lords really having become a very poor thing, reinforcing the Tudor dynasty in power, paradoxically rebalancing what had been, in fact, by this point, the traditional English say, baronial control of the same king at the parliamentary level. The Yeomen had emerged from essentially the 100 Years' War, as they had represented that gentry and more sort of communal backbone of numerical backbone of the English armies, the same ones that had been trained as longbowmen. We'll see what this also means, because they were the longbowmen of the guard as well, but that's something, if anything, we will look also better at in other videos about late medieval English warfare. We really have to do a lot. Like, the closest I've ever done to that is the English livered retainer, roughly of the Wars of the Roses era. They're still similar to like the early Tudor, probably like the Henry VII. Those English armies would have really looked very medieval in many ways. And this is in fact true for most early modern warfare, except, as we will see now, the pike especially, naturally in a brief time also the shot would kick in. That's why I was talking about the relative English backwardness at this point. Technologically, the English had to import a lot of armor, guns, horses. Basically, at this point, after the end of the 100 Years' War, they, as you know, withdrew fundamentally from the continent at large in their broader sort of regional control of certain areas of France, and therefore they remained relatively isolated. Right? England had been really well updated and very advanced during the 13th to 14th century. The 15th is really one tough motor blipper, and the results are there for the English to basically keep on going, as we will see now, with what they already had, without investing too much in any major military reform, except at sea. In fact, I made an entire video dedicated to the development of the English Navy from Henry VII to Elizabeth. That really tells you, in fact, the disparity at that point for a largely, coastal power like Britain at that point, that didn't fear too much interference, if not from Scotland in a more regular sense. Also, of course, like from France in theory, an invasion was always possible from the continent as well as to the continent, as the English were really not over with France, for example, by 1453. They attempted, as you know, with Burgundy, some other incursions, etc. And in fact, at this point, also Henry VIII does campaign in Flanders together with Charles V against Francis I. But this is all just a background that we fundamentally know. Now, in the spring of 1513, the Yeomen of the Guard marched with purpose to Plymouth, their numbers poised for a proposed invasion of Brittany. Hence showing, at this point, Brittany was not technically part of the Kingdom of France yet, right? That's a long story. I made a video about medieval Brittany. In December 1544, long after the king had returned from his French exploit in Boulogne, 185 of the Yeomen of the Guard company held the garrison in the aforementioned fortress, their presence a steadfast bulwark against the winter's chill and the enemy's threat. Yet the Yeomen, for all their prominence and versatility, were but a small ember in the broader fire of Tudor military mobilization. The true expanse of English infantry recruitment revealed itself in times of war, when the Crown called upon the vast reserves of manpower scattered across England's shires, towns, and countryside, according essentially to the old traditional recruitment style that also other countries had. The more professional permanent troops were the most sought after, the most prized ones, that made the backbone of the concrete backbone of the early modern militaries. And the other levies, the other militias were fundamentally just some kind of support. Very good at maintaining also, coastal defense against pirates, things like that, but just like inland from brigands, right? When war broke out with real Renaissance armies of mercenaries, of professionals, the same English had to recur to those. But this British, also considering that the Kingdom of England included Wales at this point, and not only, there is Ireland as well, entailed some consistent sort of throwaway but still relevant amount of local levies. This process rested, in fact, on two towering pillars, each deeply embedded in the socio-political soil of the realm. The first was a mechanism of delegated authority, through which Henry VIII entrusted nobles and gentlemen of rank with the critical task of raising and leading contingents to boast the royal host. This was typical of England, at least compared to the other, great, can say, powers in Europe. England had maintained essentially a very local form of recruitment in the hands of the same barons, of the same aristocracy. France had already a middle estate of French administrators who would recruit troops and material in a sort of bigger, more systematic way. At this point, France is the biggest, better organized state in the West, probably in a unitary sense. In any case, the men here that were recruited by the local earls in the various shires were not simply recruiters, but commanders in their own right. They're a force sanctioned by a strategic relaxation of the stringent laws that govern the maintenance of retainers. Forged by Henry VII and fiercely upheld by his son, these statutes aimed to curb the power of the nobility, as we've seen. They couldn't really dislodge them from their deeply entrenched prerogatives. However, there was some leverage made, in fact, of the same levies to sort of organize themselves further and not being too directly dependent on the nobility. In particular, this could happen by trying to prevent the formation of private armies that might rival with the crown's supremacy, as it had happened in the Wars of the Roses that had brought to the rise of the same Tudors. Yet when the need arose, as it did in the Grand Campaign of 1544, with imperials against France, these restrictions were set aside, granting the aristocracy immunity to gather armed followings. So it's literally how the indenture had historically been. And again, in the Wars of the Roses, because we made a video about the broader, tactical style of that war, like it was mostly like a matter of war bands based mostly on noblemen and their personal retinues. In fact, that was actually a pretty bloody war as we've seen, for example, for the same nobility, but it didn't devastate England more than much, as a matter of fact, because it was just about taking out that guy on the other side that, when dead, literally has an entire lineage extinguished, and so you could cash his, his inheritance through the very complicated genealogical mechanism entailed by those wars. We also saw different battles, Tewkesbury, Barnet, etc. Like, we will come back on the Wars of the Roses hopefully soon. But when another major mobilization was needed because of now such a major military effort on the continent, the only people who could practically create an army were the same noblemen. This was true also, for example, in France, as we said, except there the hierarchy was sort of much more developed and these feudal powers were much bigger. Here it happened a bit down the line, as we've seen, sometimes also in the way it had been autonomous, in fact, during the 100 Years' War, To a degree, the crown paid for this noblemen to create their retinue and go to war. Sometimes they simply would do it by themselves, for their own personal interest in France as well as in England. Now, this calculated leniency in 1544 transformed lords and knights into agents of royal will, their lineage and influence marshalling loyalty and numbers to swell the king's banners with men drawn from their estates and affinities. It was also a form of competition between them that the crown could exploit to create different parties, and so not having just the aristocracy per se against the monarchy. The second pillar reached far deeper into England's past, tapping a wellspring of obligation that stretched back to the Anglo-Saxon Fyrd. I talk about the Anglo-Saxon Fyrdmen, by the way, in my historical military units. This was the county militia, a sprawling network of men bound by ancient duties to bear arms when summoned by the sovereign. From the chalky downs of Wiltshire to the rugged hills of Derbyshire, from the scholarly precincts of Oxford to the pastoral expanses of Buckinghamshire, and across the southern counties and Wales, this system endured as a living testament to communal responsibility, stemming again from Germanic times, Romano-Germanic times, Celto-Romano-Germanic times if you want. In 1544, its potency was laid bare, with master rolls from these regions recording the capacity to field, at least on paper, 90,000 men. This is absolutely normal. We'll explain now why. A staggering figure that spoke to the resilience, at least, of these traditional levies, but of course was not practically expandable. First of all, as you know, we have explained many times, having more than 50,000 men was practically useless, impossible, first of all, and even having, more than 30,000 was basically useless. And the reason is just logistics. It's the way these Renaissance armies become also heavier than in terms of numerical quality than what they had been in the Middle Ages. By the way, at this point we are after the late medieval crisis, and technically early modern armies are fairly small, right? You look at the early pike and shot battles. I have a video incoming on this. They weren't actually bigger than 13th, 14th century European armies before crisis, right? And as we will see now, they cost also a lot. And 90,000 men, as we could go back, also we will surely make a video about medieval England, in the sense how many knights could England field, like in theory, how many men that of course like could provide with themselves without knightly equipment based on their estates, wealth, could in theory be summoned by the king just out of that public prerogative that existed in all Romano-Germanic Europe and beyond, like practically in all the world. Some thousands even. The capacity of fielding them, that's a completely different story, right? Also, just out of logistics, right? That you can't have armies that are more... But more than else, it's politics, right? How many people are simply going to answer that call, right? This is actually a very concrete problem in the Renaissance as well. And you simply don't need all those people. Also because technically these are all the eligible able-bodied freemen. So you don't really need these farmers, craftsmen, and laborers all together. Otherwise your kingdom will instantly collapse. But these were, however, the same men of the soil and the forge that would provide like at least a fraction of such manpower for the army, as some supporting militia of sort. They would set aside their daily toils to don the garb of soldiers, their service a duty woven into the fabric of their lives. Like in theory, like as freemen, that was not just a duty but a privilege, right? Naturally, in the ancient regime, this has already fallen to something very different, because it's really, again, the aristocracy that is fully in charge. But men do go to war. Now, this militia framework was not merely a military expedient, but a social covenant, in fact, linking the crown to its subjects through shared obligation. And it's ensured that Henry's armies could rise like a tide to meet the demands of war without the burden of a perpetually maintained force. Whether this tide would be able to crush any ship, right, it's another story. And in fact, these troops were sort of the cheapest, the weakest that could be fielded. But the numbers were still relevant. and even just as we've seen as local police or even as garrisons sometimes were useful at a local level. Beyond these domestic reservoirs, the Tudors cast their net across the seas, drawing in foreign mercenaries to augment their ranks with skills and numbers England could not really muster. Again, English power at this point is fairly limited. Compare also in relative terms to what had enjoyed in the previous centuries, and these mercenaries are actually the finest troops next to probably like the nobiliar households. These hired swords were a constant presence in Henry VIII's continental ventures, in particular, also because he could simply find lots of them without bringing necessarily large swathes of them back to England, as it would, however, happen in some smaller number. There were advantages and disadvantages to this, like foreigners could be hired, say, in the continent and disbanded on the continent. Bringing some of them to England could have made them more loyal to the crown, as it happened also in other countries. At this point, then, local troops, think about the same Swiss, the other German troops, especially at this point, with the strongest English connection. Their footsteps would echo from the muddy fields of France to the windswept moors of Scotland, and even in smaller clashes, in fact, against the Scots. Their recruitment was not a haphazard grab for bodies, but a deliberate strategy to compensate for England's deficiencies in certain troop types critical to contemporary warfare. The English soil yielded few pikemen. As we will see, this is the major issue. Even more than the few arquebusiers, or even heavy cavalry of its own. And so the crown turned to the mercenary markets of Europe to fill these gaps. Right, Spanish and Italian arquebusiers brought the crackle of firearms to campaigns in France and Scotland between 1544 and 1546. I made an entire video relative to, say, probably the ethnic background of Renaissance mercenaries in general. Europe was already incredibly intertwined at this point. We never sort of entered too much in the depths of that. We mostly highlighted that in late medieval and early modern warfare, there were mostly fringe areas that provided with mercenaries. But here, in fact, we will see it with the British ones, the Celtic fringe, and how England sort of drew from its, tribal, we could even say, clanic pools. This is true. Think about the Scots in the Swedish army, the 30 Years' War. So it's actually a long story. But England, in this case, required properly specialists. And some of the most advanced troops, in this case, the Spanish and the Italian arquebusiers, were actually among the best available. And that's also why you could find them abroad. It's a bit of an underrated topic. We will have to talk more about, especially the age of the Italian wars type of European warfare in general. And their expertise was a sharp contrast to the scarcity of such troops among English levies, by the way, because, of course, the arquebus was there, the pike had always been there, but again, the capacity to have adequately equipped and especially collectively drilled pike and shot formations, it's not much of an English thing during the 16th century. You have really to wait for Cromwell's new model army to have something that properly bridges the gap with continental developments. We'll see what now the English, however, compensated for this lack with. German Landsknechts, we talked about them in multiple videos with their disciplined pike formations, were a mainstay of every force sent to the continent under English control, their presence dating back to the ill-fated expedition to Spain in 1511 and enduring through the wars of 1544-46 when additional Landsknechten and men-at-arms were, so to say, borrowed from Emperor Charles V in a diplomatic exchange of martial might. When we talk about men-at-arms, of course, consider that the Landsknechten were themselves, as we've seen in the relative videos, led by men-at-arms, de facto, by noblemen. And it's not like the Germans fought just with that. We've seen it in the video about the German peasants' revolt. There were certain areas, actually some of the poorer in Germany, that would, in fact, try that venturism a bit more than much, that were very archaically feudal. And so they would, we've seen, for example, the Lorrainese army during the German peasant uprising was basically a classical, very cavalry-based feudal force, but England had historical ties with northern Germany to an important degree, also of traffics, of exchanges, and so many German mercenaries came from those less developed areas. The Landsknechten were, however, the proper imperial soldiery established by Maximilian I, and as foreign specialists were, for the English, not mere supplements but linchpins, their skills bridging the gap between England's traditional strengths and evolving demands of the battlefield. Again, you find pike and shot units pretty much everywhere in Europe at this point, but what really matters is how many they are, how cohesive they are as a force. And so that's a really different story. The Landsknechten, especially in the first half of the 16th century, were really top-notch forces. The recruitment of auxiliaries from within the British Isles further enriched this tapestry, most notably with the inclusion of the Irish Cairn. Never made a video for them for some medieval times, but made multiple videos about Irish warfare around this same era. You can check that out if you want. In 1544, during the French campaign, 600 of these fierce skirmishers were enlisted, their wild appearance and penchant for collecting the severed heads of foes striking terror into French hearts. I will not comment, of course, on the status of Ireland in the broader development of Western European Renaissance. Nevertheless, these were useful as mostly looters, as again this actually pretty warlike, individually very qualitative, but collectively more like this skirmishing force than anything. Gaelic fighters, clad in saffron-dyed tunics crafted from leaves, bark, salt, and urine, and draped in rough so-called earth mantles that doubled as bedding. By the way, these troops embodied a rugged practicality. Right, these were properly people habituated to live in the wild, like game, right? And a game that the English had hunted, for quite a while themselves. In their glib hair falling over their eyes and their primary armament of javelins, some flighted like modern darts, marked them as a distinct and fearsome addition to Henry's forces. There were characteristics they are represented, in fact, for their kind of exotic taste. I mean, some of the most famous prints of the time. Their swords of peculiar Irish design tucked under their arms rather than belted at their waists. These cairn were recruited not for pitched battles, but for raiding and harassing. Right? They would have surely been employed in open field, but with very peculiar tasks, such as skirmishing, that at this point was becoming really obsolete with larger amounts of firearms. The current mobility and ferocity, however, being a tactical asset drawn for the turbulent edges of Tudor dominion. After all, the lordship of Ireland had to be properly manned, and as you know, there had been a historical blending between the saying English and the Irish locally, and these troops were there for hire anyway. They didn't even care too much under whose banner they would serve. Given this background, far from a permanent or rigidly fixed entity, the English infantry was evidently a dynamic assembly. Its configuration summed into being only when the fires of wars, as we've seen, demanded it, and its arrangement reflecting both the king's reforming zeal and the stubborn resilience of older ways. At the dawn of this period, the organization of armies clung to a framework inherited from the Middle Ages, with forces divided into three grand battles. So, massive battle lines that echoed the wavard, main, and rearward of earlier centuries. This had an interesting concept, that is in-depth defense on the battlefield, highlighting in part that level of infantry-based traditional tactics that the English at least had become more renowned in the later Middle Ages from. Most of that, as I explained in other videos, did not really stem from any specific rigidity in having to fight on foot and or dismounted. In any case, during the Renaissance, infantry gained further weight, and England in this sense adapted in part to it. The Scottish foes, I made a video about Scottish lowland pikemen that were the bulk, in fact, of those northerners' forces, were essentially the type of enemy that the English had to cope with also for centuries, like since the wars of Scottish independence, and in a sense even before, that required, first of all, like a similar level of heavy infantry capacity, but also some means to soften up their ranks, including, for example, the longbowmen. In 1544, during Henry's ambitious campaign to France, each of these battles swelled to a formidable size, ranging from 13,000 to 16,000 men. As we were saying before, this is basically that between almost 50,000 men in total that would have, however, been very difficultly handleable in a single battle, not even just necessarily strategically deployable for any useful operational purpose, but in theory still being there and sometimes acting as separated armies on the map, their ranks dominating by dense blocks of pikemen and billmen. This is basically what English infantry in the Tudor era were fundamentally about, and especially in Henry VIII's times, sometimes consolidated into 1 to 3 imposing clusters, if so normally, because you pass from sort of again, it's not really three, it's like a triple in-depth single battle line, for example. That would have been really useless, because also the subunits would have been arrayed in a way that for how in-depth like pike formations could be also in the Renaissance, you wouldn't need, they wouldn't operate with like literally a file opener for more men than would be normal from subunits, because normally subunits are composed like that would hold the single battle line exactly to follow the guy in the front. So, you know, if you put all these three things in depth to cooperate one another, first of all, they're all cramped together, but the last of the line, there's literally worst soldier would have had to be followed by the best soldier of the previous. Like, it doesn't make any sense. At that point, you would have still had 3 in-depth battle lines, which would have been used for this gradual effort release in the typical guise of reserves, or again with one single line, normally subdivided into divisions. So a continuous body of heavy infantrymen, flanked in both options. So depending on independently from the number of lines in depth, by wings of archers and other missile troops who operated on the edges, harrying foes with volleys of arrows and shot. Right, so it's actually a simple evolution, so to say, of the medieval formation, especially of the typical one, let's say the stereotypical one that the English used during the late Middle Ages, into basically pike and shot formations with Renaissance standards. The term regiment that we made a video on just the other day emerged in Henry VIII's time, initially carrying a broad and nebulous meaning, as we were just saying, in fact, in that video, because it might denote one of these sprawling battles. For example, there were other terms to call them, such as divisions, brigades, etc., or as seen in the mid-16th century Netherlands, because operations encompassed the entirety of the troops in a theater, some 6,000 or more even, under a single loosely defined banner, regardless also of the chronically understrength force. Yet by the later years of Elizabeth's reign, the regiment had begun to take on a sharper outline, emerging as a more distinct organization commanded by a colonel. We talked about this just the other day in some depth. The French had been doing this as well, and those had also arrived late in terms of specifically infantry development, as you know, typically comprising what would become basically the standard practice of 10 to 12 companies, though in Ireland, where flexibility reigned, as the terrain was rougher and forces generally more dispersed, and also less difficultly concentrated with more difficulty, let's put it this way, because local resources were really scarce, it often shrank to 5, adapting to the rugged demands of that frontier. This is really relevant because even if you look at the English Civil War armies, you realize that not even this Celtic fringe scenario, but fundamentally the normal English countryside hedges would particularly favor some sort of skirmishing, like the shot in particular. And so you have already in the 40s of the 17th century some important increase towards like mostly the hit and run tactics, skirmishing, compared, say, to the wider and, in that sense, more populated continental battlefields. Within this broader structure, the English infantry companies themselves formed the vital sinews of Tudor military organization. The company had historically been, we've seen this to even, like again, we made very pertinent videos to these topics recently, the most tactically important unit. It is still today. In medieval warfare, we talked about free companies, for example. Reason we talk about the famous White Company actually would grow to be bigger than a company because the term is also unspecific. We were talking about that few hundred strong forces. These had historically been the troops that those noblemen usually hired, also through the indenture in English case, that would simply be available, where or another, either as subjects or soldiers for hire, that form also the backbone of the aforementioned battle lines. And still at this time, their size and composition was a kaleidoscope of variation that mirrored the era's transitional nature. In fact, the companies could range from 100 to 400 men. Their strength dictated by purpose, region, and the shifting tides of armament, defying any rigid standardization. By this point, Sir Roger Williams, a seasoned observer of the 90s of the 16th century, deemed 150 a common benchmark, which is exactly normally what a company is supposed to be. It's again the roof number of men that a directly commanding officer on the field can know to the degree he can rely on in combat, according to the relative skills capacities of these soldiers. A figure borne out by examples but from earlier decades as well. In 1558, a company might organize 140 armored pikemen and 100 unarmored pikemen alongside 100 arquebusiers. It would be a very tough one. Their ranks reflecting a growing reliance on firearms amid traditional melee strength. However, the latter remaining central. As you understand, the first ranks had to be armored because even though firearms were, of course, surpassing any level of, individual soldiers' protection, especially among the infantry, the first ranks were better protected from lead by their cuirasses. In fact, at a certain range, that would have been pretty much effective. Here, we are, of course, not too far away from the moment in which arquebuses, muskets will take over. Also in numbers, we were just saying it for actually the English Civil War, a couple of generations, or a bit more of generations later now. But at that point, that half-armored heavy infantry unit would allow, in fact, the other half to be just reserves to inject in when hopefully breaking the line. Because, again, the point here, the predominance of the infantry is that the shot is not enough to basically stop the infantry to arrive from arriving properly to the enemy one defending. By 1596, another unit arrayed 50 pikemen, 12 musketeers, and 36 caliber men. This was the caliber is the older form of English shot, right? So nothing, in fact, particularly qualitative. The muskets are, you see here, rarer, but of course they must be present by the end of the 16th century in even the relatively backwards English forces. In 1599, a company mustered 30 pikemen, 10 short weapon bearers, 30 muskets, and 30 calibers. So you see here, not just things are modernizing, but the shot is actually surpassing by probably the end of the 17th century, in certain cases at least, the pike. Each group a testament, of course, to the diversification of infantry roles that were, however, increasingly also more intertwined. The year 1600 offered a vivid snapshot of this evolution, with a company comprising 20 pikes, 10 halberds, 6 sword and buckler men, which were also a thing, especially from the Spanish model, but not only, 12 muskets with rests, 12 bastard, that is light muskets, and 40 calibers. Its eclectic mix bridging the old world of close combat and the new era of gunpowder. You could see a lot of interesting things at this point, including incredibly heavy metal shields that for some reason they literally fielded at a point of, without great success, as you understand. Here also, like, cavalry is actually regaining steam from the maximum shrink in the mid 16th century. In Ireland, English companies of 1558 averaged about 50 longbowmen and 50 arquebusiers, a balanced pairing, while a Leicestershire company of 1584 organized 80 pikemen and 80 men with firearms against 40 billmen and 40 archers, a structure Sir John Smith praised in the 90s of the 16th century, though his fondness for the bow hinted at a lingering nostalgia among the march of progress. The longbow, objected by the second half of the 16th century, had become obsolete for most Western battlefields, but the fact, for example, that in Ireland you would see it more frequently actually points to the obvious reason that it was adequate to the local standards, considered that many Gaelic warriors still literally fought like in the Middle Ages. Yes, they had guns even, but it's not, more often than not, they couldn't afford them. They knew perfectly how to use them because they were fighting with those also abroad when they received uniforms, weaponry, etc. from their employers. But locally, they would literally fight just like in the Middle Ages they would have done. And in general, I made a video about the persistence of the crossbow, the longbow, the composite bow on the Renaissance battlefields. That was an interesting one, because you see that the more east and southeast you go into Europe, and the more you can find especially more archaic weaponry. In the Celtic fringe, that is still valid, right? And it's not until the English Civil War that English nostalgia, because the English were really very attached to the longbow. It had become, as we were saying before, with the yeoman, a bit like the national weapon of the rising bourgeoisie, right? So to say, of this gentry that still, felt its political and military relevance starting from the deeds accomplished during the 100 Years' War, when English monarchs really invested in their training at local festivals with bows. There is all a sort of interesting, also psychological background to conceive. It's not like a longbow couldn't kill anyone, but let's say combined arms in this sense amplify the effect of even a single technology. So if you had, maybe one longbowman against an arquebusier, you can say it's necessarily a draw, but it can, it's not this an absurd distance, let's say. But if you have 100 arquebusiers against 100 longbowmen, well, in certain conditions, maybe they could have prevailed, but more often than not, it would have been wiped out. So the problem with England here is that they didn't even literally have enough guns on their own, and so they resorted to longbows. The London trained bands, a cornerstone of urban militia organization, reflecting the greater Londoner Third Estate affluence further illuminated this shifting landscape. By the Armada year of 1588, they had decisively abandoned the bow, aligning their ranks with pikes and firearms as the core of their formation, a transformation solidified in 1595. When bows were ruled unacceptable for their shot contingents, a clear signal of modernization's triumph to a degree. Of course, again, there was someone proposing long bows still to Charles I from the same London trained bands just before the beginning of the English Civil War. They also made a video on, by the way. So when you look at the mid-80s of the 16th century, you realize that, however, general masters in the so-called maritime counties painted a more mottled picture. These were the boroughs, like the areas that had historically basically maintained some sort of local military standards for the defense of the coastline rather than properly like participating to major expedition. And with almost 1/3 of men still organized as archers, which is actually a lot, 40% grouped with firearms, and also a bit less than a third designated as corselets, that stands for pikemen, meaning that they were armored in some ways for hand-to-hand combat. Their proportions revealing a patchwork of readiness that varied by region, to say the least. Of course, as we were saying before, like when an army was summoned by the king, there was some sort of selection based on the available manpower and material. You wouldn't bring everybody together. You would mostly try to hire professional soldiers, having them supervised, controlled by the nobility with their retinues, stiffening the numbers. And again, having, especially during the Armada period, of course, the militia readily available, but not quite involved in, say, great peregrinations across Britain. Counties such as Wiltshire, Derby, Oxford, and Buckinghamshire that we mentioned before remained strongholds of archer-heavy formations. Their militias preserving a traditional bent even as the musket's roar began to overshadow the bow's twang. This diversity in company organization, of course, underscored a military system in flux, its contours shaped by the royal edict and loyal circumstance. Henry VIII's reforms injected a new dynamism into this organizational framework, nudging England towards continental models while grappling with entrenched habits. In 1544, of the 28,000 English foot soldiers marshaled for France, the integration of fewer than 2,000 arquebusiers and a billman to pikeman ratio of 3 to 4 to 1 necessitated the inclusion of foreign contingents, Spanish and Italian arquebusiers and German Landsknechte, as we've seen, whose specialized roles were woven into a broader structure, often forming distinct wings or blocks to complement the English masses. This is shocking to a degree. I mean, first of all, there's a very low amount of shot in this mid-16th century English forces. Consider that the Italians, since the end of the 14th century, already had something like 1/3 scopiet in their infantry. So we're looking at something very obsolete in tactical proportion here. Nearly half of the heavies are billmen. Never made a video about medieval pole arms. We explained what this was about, but let's say by the mid-16th century, having still 3/7 of your heavy infantry as billmen is very archaic. It's very obsolete. It means basically that formation in terms of pike capability, if we're not talking about the shot is very low here, is to be halved almost. Thus, it's really incomplete and can hardly operate against sort of more updated armies out there without further support, stiffening of these, in fact, mostly foreign troops. All right. The bill, by the way, is often treated, at least I've seen also famous YouTubers online, as an exquisitely English thing. You know, this to be found also in Britain. Think about the Lockbert axe for the Scots, etc. But the bill had actually been a thing all over Europe in the Middle Ages. The most complete form with four distinct functions in one was the Italian bill. But by this point, look, of course, they had the forms had they were very heterogeneous, non-uniform really. These were mostly, as you understand, like troops that normally use this stuff, like also for defense in their local communities. So that there were the weapons of the non-professionals more often than not. There were some billmen that played a role, as you know, also in the English Guard, etc. However, it was now surpassed as a type of, reliable force on the battlefield. Consider that what creates essentially not modern warfare per se, because that is really established with the Gran Capitan Gonzalo de Cordova with the pike and shot system, but the notion that the pike, in fact, and not the bill, or pike and bills had to be the prevalent thing. It is true that early modern warfare was still witnessed not a completely pike-based heavy infantry. There was still a level of pole arms, infantry next to those, but the proportion was much less. This 3 to 4 billmen, pikemen is very medieval indeed. The king's push for artillery, pikes, and hand firearms reshaped the infantry's organization. Those were the most sought after forces for the English crown, introducing a layering of troop types that coexisted uneasily with the traditional formations, by the way. Here it's really a problem. Again, until the new model army, this wouldn't really be solved. Really, by the 80s of the 16th century, the musket's debut and the bow's retreat from first-line service marked a pivotal shift, with companies reorganizing to emphasize firearms and pikes, though the trained bands and county militias adapted at their own pace their structures and mirror the broader tension between innovation and tradition. It's fair to say even more that the English foot soldier in his silhouette was dominated by the billman and the longbowman, stalwarts whose presence defined the armies of the early 16th century. The billman, wielding a crude yet fearsome weapon, the brown or black bill, its blade coated in rust or varnish to preserve it, stood as a descendant of the agricultural implement turned battlefield terror, its simplicity masking a lethal efficacy proven against the Scots at Flodden in 1513, where it shattered the enemy infantry, mostly composed of pikemen, by the way, on a slippery slope, disappointing their foes' trust in long spears. That is a bit... Again, we will have to look at the Battle of Flodden in detail, because that's a hell of an English victory. But we should understand better why also that was the outcome. Because normally the pike was superior. And so if this was the outcome, something very wrong had gone from a Scottish side. So we're talking about infantry units per se, and the billmen would be, like in appearance, clad in a jack, a waist or knee-length coat quilted and covered with leather, fustian or canvas, over thick iron plates sewn within, in the heavier cases, and crowned with a simple round skull or solid helmet, remaining a cornerstone of the English force as well, as we've seen into the mid-16th century, with, by the way, corselets and morions, rare, and multi-layered canvas jackets or mail shirts still favored over newer armors, mostly also because of lack of or resources. Right. Besides the billman marches the longbowman, living echo, as we've seen, of the 100 Years' War, his weapons reputation unchallenged in English hearts, its supremacy upheld by the same Henry VIII's own prowess as an archer, and royal proclamations urging its practice. So we see definitely that continuity still at this point in the nobiliar training with every kind of weapon. It was really typical, of course, for the aristocracy, professionally trained with every kind of arm. And still, the notion that in festivals, in general public occasions, like training with longbow should be performed, should be participated by the local populace was still a thing, right? So they thought that it was really useful still in the first half of the 16th century, as it had been in the last 100 years. It kept much like his Azincourt forebearer, the longbowman would fight in the so-called old-fashioned, with bow, sword, buckler, sallet, at this point, in a two-pronged iron-shod stake to thwart cavalry charges, to fix in the ground. Mostly, it wouldn't be always possible, and again, that's not really the game changer, and never think that longbowmen per se stopped cavalry charges in any way. It was always the men-at-arms. And at this point, like the longbowman could be augmented in gear by, like, of course, another typical element was the quiver, since ever once was scarce, but now common, at least in the more elaborate, more complete form, because some longbowmen had also gone at war without proper quiver, with just arrows bunched together in other fashions. We see, by the way, this in the Earl of Northumberland's 1513 contingent clad in livery-colored leather cases, as well as bracers of leather or horn recovered from the Mary Rose shipwreck, though the absence of finger tabs hinted at the calloused resilience of seasoned hands. You know that the Mary Rose relic dates to, in fact, this Renaissance period. It's basically providing us with the best insight on not just how longbows, but also longbowmen looked like, because the shipwreck had corpses into it as well. And these were soldiers, again, being embarked, and they perished in this way. And we know a lot of interesting things about their physicality as well. And these men were almost athletes, basically, because they professionally trained with that weapon. You had, it was, very asymmetric form of training, by the way, because with archery, you're simply with different sides of the body doing different things. And so they would have been really interesting to be seen in action for delivering like the mostly sort of power shot that was necessary to harass, especially enemy cavalry, but not only. Yet this traditional duo, billman, longbowman, for all their dominance, as we've seen, was not destined to stand alone on the long run, as Henry VIII's reign ushered in a broadening array of infantry types, spurred by his importation of weapons and his keen eye on the evolving theaters of Europe. The pikemen, though initially a rarity among English troops, pikemen had always existed, but again, one thing is having them in large enough numbers and especially adequately drilled at that point to be collectively effective. And another thing is just, okay, you have a guy with a pike, it's another thing. Consider the heavy cavalry would charge into the pikes on a regular basis, and it's just the cohesion of the men from the other end of the weapon that determines whether that line will collapse, not the weapon per se, even though it's actually the only weapon with which you can stop a cavalry charge. In any case, this pikeman began to carve a place under royal encouragement. His Morris, that is literally Moorish, so intended this Berber North African type, even though it was just a way of saying pike, a novelty that impressed onlookers at the London Train Band's muster in 1539. Its long shaft, a counterpoint to the bill's shorter reach. Remember what we said about Flodden, by the way, which is also the best proof, however, that it's not the weapon that determines who wins or loses. Remember all those people commenting on YouTube or Facebook pages of him as reenactors. Oh, what does happen if I have 100 men equipped with a pike and 100 men equipped with a bill? Look at the Battle of Flodden and in any other battle where the opposite happened as an outcome. and you have the answer, that is to say, shut the fuck up. In any case, of course, the pike was designed, in fact, to be functionally used. So if you found them on the battlefield, because at large it would have been used by pertinent people, and at large, of course, the pike had an advantage, but that was not necessarily decisive. By 1544, the retinues of the Privy Chamber gentlemen could muster only 380 pikemen against 1073 billmen, their numbers scant yet growing. But as we were saying before here, it's a fair proportion even of how, in at least these are the retinues of the Privy Chamber gentlemen. So they are not necessarily pikemen inclined, because they would be still mostly cavalrymen, etc. But here we're talking about the infantry element of the retinue. And so the sense here is that you want to have more support sort of melee forces, which as the, with the bill, like given that you have to support cavalry, also how do you maintain cohesion? If you support these guys close range, it depends, because also various troops types would have been arrayed often in, among their own correspectives, regardless from which units they came from. But that's a good hint, because before we saw bill pike 3 to 4, here it's literally 4 to 10. All right, so it's even less pikemen, and this pikemen would have been often clad in jacks. We talk about this retinue force, or for the fortunate corselets, their role bolstered by the king's vision of a force capable of facing French armies on equal terms, which, at least as we said before, was in part feasible because the French did not really have very good infantry, or at least they had the Swiss. And so in that case, it would have been a problem. Hence, you needed the Landsknecht, and they were also always happy to kill some Swiss. But again, not much like if anything, the French still had likely better native pikemen than the English, or at least enough to cope with the English one. Alongside them, as we know, as we've seen emerge, the arquebusier, a herald of the firearms ascendance, his weapon a crackling innovation, and numbered, as we've seen before, literally 1 to 14 in the English component of the expedition sent to France in 1544, next to, as we've seen, the foreign mercenaries, etc. Promoted by a royal proclamation that same year, swiftly retracted in 1546 amid peace and royal wariness of an armed populace. That's also the same reason why the French wouldn't arm these masses and frame and regimenting them properly. The same would in part you see for England, because we said before, the people, yes, could be useful to counterbalance the nobiliar power for the crown, but up to a certain point. Here it's, times of Reformation, it's pretty bad things are happening in general. In any case, this arquebusier often bore imported wheellocks, deemed finer than the slender matchlocks scorned by the king's agent in Antwerp. His jack and sallet marking him as a bridge between old and new. And we have to talk about the foreigners as well, because what would it look like in this English employ? Well, the German Landsknecht, I made an entire video about the German Landsknecht dress, by the way, was hired in droves for every continental campaign that English carried out this period, standing as a distinct type within this evolving roster. His presence a necessity born of England's paucity of native pikemen. In 1511, during the ill-fated Spanish expedition, and again in 1544-46 across France and Scotland, these mercenaries brought their towering pikes and gaudy attire, slashed garments in stark contrast to English simplicity, into Henry's service, some donning leather jerkins or mail mantles, others wielding the archetypal cat's balga short swords with its knuckle and ring guards, their minimal armor a testament to their reliance on formation and ferocity. Again, if you are very good at piking, so to say, in mass formation, that's the entire point or Renaissance warfare, combined of course with a shot as well, you don't need armor. You need actually more men to, at that point, overwhelm the enemy. That's the reason why, at large, armor is fading everywhere. In 1544, a Landsknecht captain might gleam in black and white plate armor, his boar spear a mark of command, his bastard sword of German make swinging at his side, a figure of martial splendor amid the plainer English ranks. Again, the Landsknechten were particularly motivated. They came from some very peculiar also psychological background, considering their role in German society, and they had largely copied the Spanish fashion, which was very flamboyant, very extravagant, sort of punks, right? Counter-cultural forces. The yeomen of the guard, expanded under Henry VIII, offered this other type of look in 1520 at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, when Henry VIII met with Francis I. One yeoman of the guard might carry a longbow in green and white Tudor livery that we discussed in a video about, in fact, the very later medieval sort of dress uniformity among soldiers. While by 1538, another could bear a halberd in red with a crowned rose, their half armor a practical choice for field duty. In 1513, the Earl of Northumberland's 100-man guard included halberdiers in, quote, Almain rivet armor, German-made, with arm defenses tied by points and hands shielded by splints, visored sallets, and Italian swords in the German style, their elite status evident in such gear. As the century progressed, new types of troops proliferated, each marked by distinct armament and purpose. For example, the musketeer, emerging in the 80s of the 16th century, wielded a heavier firearm. His muskets would rest, as we've seen, 12 in the 1600 company, or lighter bastard muskets, another 12 signaling the bow's decline. His Morion helmet, a nod to modern trends, mostly like a Spanish influence. The caliber man, with his lighter gun that we have seen before, number 36 in 1596 and 40 in 1600 within the company, would complement with his agility the musketeers, at least part of the musketeers' power. The halberdier, often a color guard, appeared with 10 in 1600. In company, his weapon a refined evolution of the bill, while the sword and buckler man, 6 in the same master, danced through close quarters with nimble grace. The spearman was also a Welsh relic of the English armies of the period, persisting with long spears outnumbering bills in Denbighshire in 1539 master. An anachronism amid the flux. Shorter weapons also existed, daggers, etc., especially from the Celtic fringe. It was all that kind of sort of bloodier gear, at least at close, properly into hand-to-hand fighting, almost wrestling style. So this is more or less the picture. Like, the billman's reign faded as pikes and halberds also rose. The longbowman's glory dimmed after 1588, though cherished on the Scots border, while pikemen, arquebusiers, musketeers later, and caliber men surged forward, their ascent driven by Henry VIII's reforms and the lessons of Flodden and beyond. There's Pinky Cloak. There are, again, there are a few big battles, especially in Britain, but also on the continent for that matter, from the English side. But we've seen the mix of this all. Landsnakes and cairns, enriching this with foreign flair, yeomen adding the elite polish, and the array of arms, from stakes and quivers to cats, balgers, and javelins, right? So this is the heterogeneity of Tudor armies that really represents the stage in English military development, in parts stagnating, in parts backward as we've seen, but in other ways trying to complement at least with the finest available. That was pretty costly to get, nevertheless necessary. Otherwise there could have never even probably been a competition of any sort with other powers. I have something more incoming about Tudor warfare, by the way, so we will see this at some point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.